Welcome everyone to our Spring Innovation Business and Law Center speaker series. I'm Jason Rantanen. I'm a professor at the University of Iowa College of Law and the director of the Iowa Innovation Business and Law Center. Today, it's my great honor to welcome Professor Lisa M. Fairfax, the Alexander M. Hamilton Professor of Business Law at George Washington University Law School and the director of the GW Corporate and Governance Initiative. Professor Fairfax is a renowned scholar of corporate law, corporate governance, fiduciary obligations, stakeholder activism, board diversity, affinity fraud, and securities fraud. She's authored numerous articles and book chapters, as well as a book entitled Shareholder Democracy, a primer on shareholder activism and participation. In addition to her teaching and scholarship, Professor Fairfax is also a former member of the National Adjudicatory Council of the Financial Industry Regulation Authority and the Committee on Corporate Laws of the Business Section of the American Bar Association. She also practiced with the firm of Ropes and Gray and graduated from Harvard College and Harvard Law School. Today, Professor Fairfax will be delivering a talk entitled Racial Reckoning with Economic Inequities, Board Diversity as a Symptom and Partial Cure, which will critically examine the presumption that board diversity advances the call to promote racial equity in the economic sphere. She'll talk for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions. You can type your questions into the Q&A function in the Zoom webinar as we go along, and she'll have some time to answer them at the end. So with that, welcome, Professor Fairfax.
So first, thank you so much for having me. I'm so delighted to be speaking here today. I will confess to having very fond memories and thoughts with regard to Iowa, not the least of which is because your law review has published one of my articles, and I hope I wasn't too problematic of an author in that endeavor, but certainly have also visited the campus and always enjoyed my time there. I am so happy today to be sharing with you my thoughts about the intersection between corporate law and issues of race, particularly at the board level. Like so much of the discussion around race, I start my discussion kind of thinking back to last summer and the police shootings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many other unarmed Black men and women, which clearly created a moment which many people felt was a clear movement around racial awareness and racial reckoning. In response, many people, of course, responded to the moment, but included in that response was corporations. And one of the projects that I engaged in this summer was looking at the manner in which corporations responded. And one of the things I know that we're all aware of is that corporations began sending out all of these messages via your email, on their websites, all of these statements pertaining to Black Lives Matter. And I actually did a study of the corporations in the Fortune 500. And what I found was 81% of Fortune 100 companies issued some type of statement with regard to the summer. 65% of Fortune 500 companies issued some type of statement. And the vast majority of companies that issued some type of statement included something about Black lives and the mattering of Black lives. It's also the case that the vast majority of those companies essentially talked about the fact that it was important not to be silent. So Cisco's statement noted, "We will not be silent about our fight against racism and discrimination." CenturyLink expressed a similar sentiment. "Now is an important time to raise our voice against the racism and violence faced by Black people." Biogen, "Now is not the time to be silent." American Airlines, "We are privileged with leadership. We have a responsibility to use our voices within the business community to encourage and support corporate efforts to eliminate systemic racism in America." The other thing that corporations started to do is not just say we can't be silent in this moment, but we have to do more than just say, right? We have to talk the talk. Companies started actively committing to doing certain things. More than 40% of the Fortune 500 companies I looked at pledged to make a charitable contribution to some organization engaged in the fight against racial inequities. Pledges range actually from $400 million to multiple millions of dollars. And you saw actually companies starting to do more than just make charitable contributions, but talk about their particular commitments that they were going to make. So some of these commitments were vague and some of them were more specific. But certainly you hear companies like United Airlines saying we have to stand against racism, but also we won't just talk. We're going to denounce bigotry. We're going to commit to doing our part to promote change. And in the midst of all of these commitments came a commitment not just to address racism more broadly, but also to look within, right? And to do their part to look within. And oftentimes the commitment to look within came with it a commitment to focus particularly on the corporate board. And to increasing the number of racial and ethnic directors on the board, with a particular emphasis on Black directors. And in fact, in September of 2020, the board challenge emerged, which was founded by a group of business leaders with at least one Black director. And they launched an initiative to encourage every US corporation to pledge to appoint at least one Black director within the next year, including companies like Nextdoor, Zillow. This corporate commitment, right, not just the general one, but this specific commitment to increasing board diversity, I believe begs an important question. And that question is, what does it have to do with anything? That is, what exactly does board diversity have to do with improving racial equity? What exactly does it have to do with the summer of 2020 and all of the racial reckoning that took place on the heels of that summer? My thesis in my talk today is essentially an attempt to answer that question. And that answer comes in two parts. First, I argue that board diversity is a necessary, though far from sufficient, response to the calls and the commitments around racial equity, particularly in the economic sphere. Second, though, I argue that while this current environment presents, I believe, a real opportunity to enhance board diversity, I believe it continues to pose real challenges. And many of those challenges, I believe, are associated with the failure to appropriately grapple with the racial bias and discrimination that has historically prevented corporations from meaningfully increasing the number of racial and ethnic directors on their board. Right now, I'm just going to pause because I want to make clear that when I use, at least in this talk, the term board diversity, I am talking specifically about diversity with respect to race and ethnicity, and more particularly with a focus on Black people. I believe that in light of the fact that the summer's racial reckoning and the response to that reckoning was a response to the mattering of Black lives, I believe that means it's important to ground any discussion seeking to assess the appropriateness of that response, corporate or otherwise, through the prism of race and Black people, which of course does not mean that I don't care about other instances of diversity. I'm clearly a woman and care very deeply about those issues and care very deeply about diversity more broadly. But I believe this summer and the entire Black Lives Matter movement was a movement around race and a movement around the mattering of Black lives. And therefore, I believe it's important to interrogate this question about board diversity through that prism. So first, I want to talk about why should there be skepticism about whether board diversity connects with racial equity in the summer of racial reckoning. And I will note that on the one hand, when the Black Lives Matter movement advanced an economic agenda, which that movement did, it was essentially focused on the workforce more generally and on grappling with the inequities that has left significant wage, income, savings, and wealth disparities, right? Discussing the economic agenda related to the Black Lives Matter movement, one commentator said that that agenda seeks to disrupt the policies that foster inequities and, quote, begin the process of economic empowerment, especially for the most economically marginalized people in the Black community. In this context, I think one can legitimately ask, how does a policy, how do initiatives aimed at increasing the number of Blacks and other people of color on the corporate board, most of whom we have to recognize are not the most economically marginalized, how is that a part of this effort to enhance racial equity and racial justice? My thesis is that it absolutely is connected, and it's connected for at least 3 reasons. The first is that the lack of board diversity is actually a visible sign of the racial inequity in the broader workforce and economy. At the time of the summer 2020 protests, America's boards were simply not diverse. 37% of S&P 500 boards did not have a single Black director. Blacks also only accounted for 10% of directors at the largest S&P 500 companies and 9% of those directors at Fortune 500 companies. Studies to date at that time indicated that the number of Black directors either had not budged for some number of years or had been decreasing in the past couple of years. To be clear, though, there are also individual economic ramifications to this lack of board diversity. Directors make money. Directors accumulate stock. Boards provide unique access. And thus, being a board has an individual impact on the ability to create and transfer wealth more broadly to the Black community and communities of color. That means that their lack in the C-suite, the lack on the board, means that they're being shut out of important aspects of economic opportunity. Importantly, though, this lack of board diversity represents a symptom of the problem of racial inequities in the economic realm caused by racial bias and discrimination. Even though Blacks account for close to 13% of the population and workforce, and people of color account for a growing percentage of the population and workforce, their numbers systematically diminish the higher up the corporate ladder you go, right? And this ladder, of course, includes the corporate board. A robust array of studies reveal that at every single stage of the labor market, people of color in general and Black people in particular face race-based discrimination that has not changed in the decades upon decades since anti-discrimination laws were passed, seeking to address this issue. At the hiring stage, in the workforce itself, and with respect to promotion and retention, Blacks face obstacles that undermine their ability to advance into top slots. And these are often obstacles more significant than those faced by women and other people of color. The lack of board diversity, therefore, is a continuation of this discriminatory practice, especially because corporations rely heavily on the C-suite to fill the boardroom. Given that the road to the C-suite is littered with racial bias and discrimination, the road and the discrimination that impedes progress along that road has led basically to a lack of diversity on the board. The lack of diversity in the C-suite and the board are therefore, in my view, canaries in the coal mine, signals of the significant racial barriers that serve to impede Black people's advancement in the labor market. A Harvard Business Review study put it this way: according to both quantitative and qualitative data, working African Americans, from those laboring in factories and on shop floors to those setting C-suite strategy, still face obstacles to advancement that other minorities and white women do not. Studies consistently link those obstacles to persistent racial bias and discrimination that has not declined in some 50 years. Again, the idea here is that there is bias throughout the stages of the workforce. Bias at the resume stage, which has led, in fact, to some Blacks and people of color whitening their resume. Bias at the interview stage, bias at the hiring stage, and bias at the promotion and retention stage. All of that combines to impede the progress of Blacks up the economic ladder and into positions that would feed into the board. Diversifying the board, therefore, I believe, is critically linked to the broader effort to acknowledge these barriers and eradicate them in the economic sphere. The second reason why I believe board diversity is linked to this broader racial equity piece is actually as a signal of credibility. You know what? We've been here before. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is we've been in a situation where corporations purport to be equal opportunity employers who care about racial equity, but too often their words do not transform into action. Indeed, in this current racial reckoning, almost every corporation has admitted that their former efforts have fallen short, right? Have failed to achieve their stated goals and preferences, right? We've been here before where boards have said that they believe in board diversity, where corporations have said that they're going to try to make progress in this area. Why should we take these black squares, heartfelt statements, and poignant commercials seriously? One way I believe to take them seriously is for companies to diversify their board. One set of Ernst & Young researchers, I believe, put it quite nicely. The lack of racial and ethnic board diversity, quote, speaks for itself and likely sends a stronger signal to investors, employees, and other stakeholders than the company's messaging in this area. That is, if your board isn't diverse, why should we trust your messaging around racial equity concerns more broadly? So board diversity is an important credibility signal. Third, I believe addressing board diversity increases the likelihood that corporations will focus on issues of racial equity and increases the likelihood that corporations will be held accountable for whether and to what extent they focus on those issues. Here, let me be very clear. I do believe it's important not to overpromise or overstate. Boards have limits. Boards focus on governance. They do not get involved in the day-to-day affairs of the corporation. And thus, there are a lot of policies with racial dimensions, a lot of practices with racial implications that are beyond the purview of the board. And there are also only about 10 to 12 people. That's the average size of a board. So they're not going to be able to catch everything or sufficiently oversee everything. I teach corporations, and one of the things we were talking about is we were talking about problematic commercials that have racial overtones, or sometimes not even overtones, but kind of direct racism associated with them. And then we were talking about whether and to what extent the board would even be aware that these commercials were in production and being produced, let alone whether or not a board would have the authority to review them or pull them before they had a kind of negative impact on the company. So boards have limits around what they do and what we expect them to do. It's also the case that individual directors have limits. There is considerable literature on critical mass and the fact that without at least 3, individual minorities may not feel comfortable raising different views and also may not be able to be heard when they raise them. That is, their concerns and issues may be minimized. Also, I think it is very important not to discount the important role and responsibility of white directors. Let's face it, we cannot move the needle on addressing racial inequities unless we have the buy-in, the voice, and the support of white directors, all right? So I don't want to overpromise about what directors are going to be able to do in this space because there are clear limitations. We have to recognize that a lot of companies with diverse boards continue to have very few Black people in senior management and continue to have problems with racial equities in their workforce and beyond. From this perspective, therefore, board diversity, I believe, is a beginning and not an end. Board diversity can set you up, but it doesn't mean that you're going to get all the way there. However, board diversity, I believe, plays a very important role in this entire process. Boards do play a role in tone setting and expectations. They can ask questions, set expectations and priorities, including setting measurable goals. In fact, recent research actually demonstrates that the more diverse a board is, the greater likelihood it is that both the board and the corporation will prioritize racial equity, not just on the board, but throughout the entire corporation. So board diversity matters with regard to setting the tone and setting priorities. Boards also have a very important role to play with regard to accountability. They can follow up. They can tie their expectations to meaningful goals and consequences. They can help the corporation remain vigilant around these issues. They can bring an important perspective, right? Individual directors can alter the conversation and perspective in the boardroom. Empirical research highlights the fact that it actually only takes one different person in a room to change the conversation, to change what people will say and what they will not say. That may mean that the conversation happens in the halls or in another Zoom room, but it is the case that in a broad group, even one director can impact the tenor and tone of a conversation. Having one director adds important insight, adds important perspective at the highest levels of the corporate enterprise to consider diverse initiatives and their impact. While critical mass is, again, clearly important, it's also the case that many directors, of color are actually used to being the only. All right. Once you make it up the corporate ladder, it's likely that there are fewer and fewer of you, right, in the room where it happens. And that means that many directors of color, even when they are the only, they are used to understanding how to navigate situations and how to have influence even within those types of settings. So even one director matters, one director of color, one Black director can matter and can have an input. Finally, while it is clearly the case that we need the support and buy-in from white directors, it is often the case that white allies do not speak up without prodding and support from Black colleagues. It turns out they too need critical mass to support what they may feel is a diverse viewpoint and a diverse perspective. This means that it's too often the case that without Black directors, without directors of color, it is less likely that these issues will even surface, even if you're in a room with otherwise well-intentioned white directors. And we all have been there. Maybe you haven't, but I have. When I have spoken up in a room where I'm the only about an issue that I believe has racial impact or racial overturns. And then some of my white colleagues will later say, oh, I'm so glad you said that. I was thinking that too. Right? They wait oftentimes for other people in the room, other people of color in the room to speak before they lead in that way. That's not all the time true, but too often the research suggests that's the way it happens. And that's why it's important to have that voice, that viewpoint, that person in the room. Again, board diversity is not a cure-all. I don't want it to suggest that we're going to solve all of the ills of the racial inequitable landscape, but it is an important starting place for setting a key tone in the corporation, for signaling credibility, and it's a part of the very important solution associated with eliminating racial disparities in the economic labor market. So that, of course, begs the question, will this current wave of racial reckoning lead to meaningful change in board diversity along racial and equity and ethnic lines, and particularly with regard to Black directors? On the one hand, there's lots of things to be positive about. Lots of companies have voluntarily pledged, like I talked about in that board challenge, to increase the number of Black directors and directors of color on their board. Some individual directors have stepped up. I'm sure many of you heard about the fact that the co-founder of Reddit resigned from his board to make way for a Black candidate. And that company not only pledged to appoint a Black director, but followed through with that pledge, appointing not just its first ever Black director, but 2 Black directors for the first time in its history. There are also lots of shareholders getting involved in this push towards racial diversity on the board. Institutional shareholders like BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard are now saying that they have an expectation that boards will increase their diversity with respect to race. And they have indicated that they're going to not only make this an engagement priority when they talk to companies, but they will start considering voting against directors who have boards that lack sufficient racial and ethnic diversity. There's some shareholders that have gone even farther. The New York Comptroller, for example, sent letters to dozens of companies saying that those companies should implement the so-called Rooney Rule for corporate boards. I'm a huge sports fan. That rule is named after Pittsburgh Steelers great Rooney, and it basically says that you should require that for each vacant board seat, for each vacant slot, that a person of color be considered, be in the candidate pool. Shareholders are saying that's a way to prioritize board diversity, to ensure that you at least have people of color in the candidate pool. There's also a new initiative by the Illinois State Treasurer, backed by investors reflecting some $3 trillion in assets. And that initiative focuses on disclosure. That initiative involved sending letters to companies in the Russell 3000, asking that they disclose the racial, ethnic, and gender diversity of their boards. Turns out the vast majority of companies do not voluntarily disclose that information. And that means that too often it's the case that when we're trying to even figure out whether or not corporations have diversity on their board, you're looking at pictures and trying to is that person? And so this initiative to ensure more data is another thing that is promising, because if you don't measure it, you're not going to figure out how it can matter. California is also leading the way. California has mandated that certain companies who are in California have underrepresented minorities on their board, similar to their mandate around gender diversity. Finally, the federal realm has gotten involved, and Nasdaq has proposed a comply or explain rule that would ask companies to either comply and have at least one underrepresented minority on their board, or explain why they do not. Nasdaq's rule also proposes disclosure around board diversity, right? This type of activity is extremely promising. And that's because the combination of voluntary corporate compliance, increased shareholder pressure, and regulatory initiatives have led to an increase actually in gender diversity on boards, increasing the number of women on boards and the percentages of women in each new class of directors. So the hope is that all of this stuff can have the same impact with regard to race. And in fact, some of the data suggests that it is doing just that. The data thus far suggests that there has been movement in the area with regard to, in particular, Black directors. The number of new Black directors increased dramatically in the second half of 2020, following the summer of 2020, growing by some 200%. Right? There were 130 new Black directors in the second half of 2020. At least 35 companies appointed new Black directors. Many companies went from 0 to 1. Many other companies went from 0 to 2. Many companies went from 1 to 3. So the question is, will that pace continue? Are we really going to see meaningful change? Alas, I have to end on a note of caution. While I think this era brings with it some reason for optimism, I do think that there's reason to be cautious. And all of that actually centers around race, in the history of race, both in this country and with respect to corporations. First, race has proven to be an intractable thing, right? Many have already recognized that the push to focus on race will likely be harder than the push and the effort associated with gender. Even though there has been pressure for a number of years, so the summer of 2020 was not the first time people have been saying we need to diversify boards. There's been a push around this for a very long time. Notwithstanding that, race has lagged meaningfully behind other forms of diversity. Women on boards have been breaking records, even as race and ethnic diversity has stalled or decreased. This year and last year, we reached a milestone with regard to women. Every corporation in the Fortune 100 and in the S&P 500 had at least one woman on their board. That is remarkable, but the same cannot be said for Black directors and directors of color. Keep in mind, too, that when we talk about women, we are by and large just talking about white women. That means the meaningful progress that's been made with respect to women, the same has not been true from women of color. Black women continue to hold only about 3% of overall corporate board seats. That is a number that we have not seen movement around for years, right? So it's not clear that we can expect the same level of success that we've seen with regard to gender when it comes to race. It is true that one report said that There are still a full 2/3 of Russell 3000 companies without a single Black director at the end of 2020. Some companies only have one director, right? So we continue with that trend. And we know, right, again, that race is different. Race is likely to be more challenging. The second reason for concern in this area is, quite frankly, the reluctance to prioritize race. And this reluctance can be seen in a bunch of different ways. First, you should note, and I already said that, right? The push for board diversity has been happening for quite some time. Notwithstanding that push, it took the summer of 2020 before shareholders, legislators, corporations began really identifying race as a priority, right? As distinguished from gender. Up until that point, whenever people were talking about board diversity, they were by and large talking about gender. For example, California already had a board diversity rule in place before the summer of 2020, but that rule focused particularly on gender and not race, right? Lots of shareholders, lots of other groups were pushing around diversity, but not really pushing around race. This reluctance to prioritize race is a potential concern. The reluctance to prioritize race can also be seen in the growing movement to define diversity without regard to race, gender, or any other type of kind of demographic diversity. Instead, focusing on experience and ideology. A 2017 Deloitte survey found that 95% of respondents, and these were boards and people associated with boards, believe that boards needed diversity. 95% of those surveys said that boards needed diversity. However, 90% of those surveyed indicated that board diversity could not be achieved simply through racial and gender diversity. And there was actually a recent panel that I was just on where people were talking about the same thing. When we say diversity, we have to be more expansive. We shouldn't just focus on race and gender. We should focus on diversity of kind of viewpoints, diversity of backgrounds, diversity of perspective, right? And that is kind of a more broadening understanding of diversity. And that is, of course, the suggestion that it doesn't have to be. And we shouldn't think about it as tied to race and gender, and particularly as tied to race. I want to tell you something. This notion that a board can diversify without race or gender is inconsistent with reality. Why do I say that? All of the empirical evidence reveals that the only way to date that boards have increased their diversity of experience, perspective, background is by increasing racial, gender, and ethnic diversity. Those are the directors that bring different professional experiences, different backgrounds, even different age diversity in comparison to their white counterparts. In fact, if you compare a board of all white men with a board that is diverse, including racial and gender diversity, what you will find is the board of all white men is much more likely to have a very narrow range of experiences, a narrow range of backgrounds, right? And actually a narrow range of perspective vis-a-vis the board that has racial and gender diversity. Moreover, since race and gender are key determinants of experience and perspective, adding that diversity also increases board diversity in these other ways. In other ways, right, the data suggests that it is extremely unlikely that companies, that boards are going to achieve diversity of perspective, experience, and background without achieving racial and gender diversity. And that means that this whole idea of experiential diversity is a head fake. Right? It is one way to not prioritize gender, not in particular prioritize race diversity. And it's a way to shift the conversation and to shift prioritization. And it is troubling because in fact, there are many people of color that sign on to that and are willing to say, you know what, you're right. But I'm telling you, the data suggests you're wrong. The data suggests that companies actually do not diversify in meaningful ways unless and until they diversify with regard to race, in particular, and gender. The third thing that is concerning is that there remains an insistence with many corporations with doubling down on board nomination and selection processes, as well as board criteria, that all have proven to perpetuate the racial status quo, right? So we have this issue that even as boards claim to want more diversity and claim to want to change their status quo, they continue to engage in processes and procedures that the research all consistently reveals will only perpetuate the status quo. First, for example, corporations and their boards oftentimes rely heavily on board nomination and selection processes that are flawed, in that they continue to rely on processes that focus on current boards, traditional social and professional circles, and traditional current search firms and traditional social networks. So the most recent research shows that 80% of boards continue to rely on the same kind of social circles, professional networks, search firms that they did, right, previous times, even when they are actively seeking board candidates who are Black or people of color. However, every survey, every empirical research tool, right, reveals that these things do not work to meaningfully advance people of color into the corporate board. Instead, they serve to perpetuate the racial status quo. And that's because people know who they know. That is because our networks tend to be incredibly racially biased. And so almost everybody agrees that the only way you can really have meaningful progress here is to change the way you do business with regard to selecting, right, and nominating boards. The truth of the matter is there are dozens of organizations focused on promoting board diversity, right? However, the research suggests that companies are not using them. The most recent survey of board practices found that only 8% of boards rely on organizations committed to diversity when seeking to diversify their board, all right? The rest of them rely on channels that are basically guaranteed to reproduce the status quo. And then they complain about a pipeline problem. The second thing to keep in mind is that corporations, many of them continue to place a big emphasis on CEO or former CEO status or C-suite status, which again, all of the research points to translating into no meaningful change in the status quo. Currently, there are only 3 Black CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. So there is no pipeline there. Studies also suggest that the C-suite is devoid of Blacks and people of color, right? The good news is that there are lots of corporations starting to get the message and it's starting to expand their searches here. The problem is this is incremental. And just to be clear, this is why I have both optimism and pessimism. To what extent are boards going to realize the importance of expanding what they do and how they do business? All right. So what we have seen, at least historically, is that when you're dealing with companies that have the most entrepreneurial and innovative people, right? Or so we've been told. And yet too often they fall back on things that don't work. And if they fall back on that pattern again, we could have a problem. The final thing I want to point out, and the final thing that could be a roadblock to meaningful progress, is the racial bias that pervades how we engage this issue of diversity. There is a certain differential treatment when we think about board diversity that emerges when we have this conversation. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that when it comes to criteria that impedes racial diversity, such as, for example, CEO status, the corporate community has been willing to embrace that criteria without any meaningful empirical data. That doesn't mean that there's not a good reason why you should have a CEO on the board. What I'm saying is that there's very little empirical evidence linking CEO status with corporate or board performance. We've just taken it on faith. Moreover, there is at least some limited data suggesting that particularly an over-reliance on CEO status, especially current CEOs in the boardroom, could have potentially negative ramifications for both board and corporate performance. But we've kind of not really talked about that as much, leading to this situation where the corporate community has essentially relied heavily on a board characteristic that undercuts diversity without any real meaningful empirical evidence that it's necessary. Why is that a problem? Because again, in all other worlds, maybe that's okay. The problem is, by contrast, there is a virtual deluge of studies seeking to demonstrate a link, an empirical link, between board diversity and corporate performance. The studies exist because the corporate community has been unwilling to embrace board diversity without empirical support. They have been unwilling to accept a proposition that kind of seems intuitive, right? Greater diversity means more perspective, right? All of these things but the community has been unwilling to embrace that without some empirical support. Perhaps more importantly, the community has been unwilling to embrace board diversity, even when there are studies demonstrating a positive correlation between board diversity and corporate performance. To be sure, the evidence is mixed. And this is what a lot of people say. The evidence is mixed, so we're not sure. But that's not the point. The point is that the corporate community, right, doesn't care about the state of the evidence when we're dealing with things that don't involve diversity. They haven't asked us to produce evidence, but instead they have said with regard to diversity, you got to prove it, which is the same thing I believe is saying you got to prove your worth. You got to prove that you add value. This demand for proof is a form of racial bias that the literature refers to as a presumption of incompetence. All right? Blacks are presumed incompetent and thus must prove their worth, often repeatedly, while whites are presumed competent. And not only do they not have to prove their value, but they get the freedom to make mistakes without repercussions. A recent Korn Ferry study actually captured this presumption and talked about the negative ramifications associated with it, especially for Black people. So race matters. These issues of racial bias that kind of still pervade the board corporate practice may undermine the ability to have meaningful progress in this area. Again, my conclusion is that, number one, boards are not all the solution. The board diversity is not the total solution, but I believe it's an important place to start. However, I believe that there are some areas of concern, and unless we meaningfully address them, we may not be able to move the needle. Finally, I would just say this: if board diversity is the canary in the coal mine, and we cannot move the needle with respect to board diversity, it may suggest that we will have severe challenges moving the needle on the broader effort to achieve racial equity in the workforce and the economy. So with that, I thank you for your indulgence, and I'm happy to answer questions and engage with you more broadly.
Well, thank you, Professor Fairfax, for that fantastic talk. We have a few questions, and so I'm going to go ahead and start asking. You can ask some more questions, and we've got about 10 or 15 minutes for questions. So first question is the largest obstacle. What do you think is the largest obstacle, the single biggest obstacle to enhancing board diversity, particularly with respect to race? And I'm wondering if you think not just legal, but also structural barriers, right? Is it, rather than just being the entire system, are there particular places where it might be especially effective to insert a lever?
Wow, I mean, it's hard for me to say just one. I do believe that the the nomination and selection process is a huge potential barrier. If we continue to rely on processes that lean on insular networks, right, that is going to be a huge barrier. I think the other barrier is the data, right? Not knowing whether and to what extent boards are even diverse, right? So, and that is important because external stakeholders are interested in this, but they can't push around it if they don't have the information to push. So I would say those are, at least two big obstacles.
The next question is focuses on Milton Friedman's view that boards of directors' sole function should be to enhance shareholder value. So what are your thoughts on that?
Very good. So it's interesting, this moment right now in corporate governance history is one in which many shareholders are beginning to recognize that you cannot enhance shareholder value in a meaningful way without focusing on other stakeholders. So I believe that even Milton Friedman would say, if we're talking about enhancing shareholder value, that you have to focus on other stakeholders, right? You're not going to be able to enhance shareholder value, particularly in the long term, if you don't have a workforce. And the workforce is changing and needs to be diverse if you expect to continue that workforce, right? You're not going to be able to enhance shareholder value if you're not adding value for your customers and clients, many of whom have expectations around diversity that you need to satisfy, right? And one of the reasons why my corporate class was having the discussion about this commercial that had racial overtones is because the commercial, right, angered lots of potential customers. And the immediate thing they did was say, let's call for a boycott. Don't use any more of these products. Don't do, right? So number one, right, in this era, people are saying diversity matters, right? It has an impact on performance in a whole bunch of different ways. And so even if all you care about is shareholder value, you have to care about other stakeholders, and other stakeholders actually care about diversity. And the last thing I'll say is that, remember, I also said that there are many studies that say that a more diverse board, there is a correlation between that and corporate performance. And one of the reasons why is because diversity just adds broader perspective, and you are going to ask different questions and may pick up on different things, because you have a diverse board, which could lead to enhanced value. So I believe Milton Friedman would be all on board.
All right. The next question is, beyond diversity, what role should boards play in advancing racial equity? For example, should they throw corporate weight behind not only tax cuts, but things like a raise in the minimum wage, knowing that many minimum wage workers are Black?
Yeah, so, this is what I meant when I said, I don't want to overpromise, but I do think that boards can play a role here, right? It is, studies suggest that when you have more diversity in the boardroom, it's much more likely that the board is going to prioritize these broader issues. And at the very least, it may mean that the board is going to ask different questions, right? Are we thinking about what our workforce looks like and how we can value that workforce in a meaningful way? Are we thinking about how to close the gender and race gap with regard to wages, with regard to promotion, right? So I do think that, boards can't make day-to-day decisions. That's not where they're going to be, but they can ask questions about how are we thinking about these decisions, right? How are we prioritizing them? There has been a lot of conversation about human capital management at the board level. How is the company thinking about managing? And by that, I just mean, how are we thinking about managing our workforce, right? A workforce that's going to look very differently. And a part of that management is making sure that you have in place practices that are designed to be diverse, equitable, and inclusive. Otherwise, you may lose the workforce or have problems with regard to your workforce that will be expensive to fix.
Thank you. The next question is, what are your thoughts on the concept of recycle rates for people of color on boards in which there's a claim of increased diversity, but in reality, it's the same 2 to 3 people who are serving on multiple different boards?
It's a very good observation. And it is true, or at least it certainly used to be true, that of all of the directors, Black directors and directors of color tend to be holding many board seats. I think there was one director, something like 19, not at the same time, but like throughout his career. And oftentimes the reason why that happens is because of this incredibly insular social network problem, which is, it turned out that as soon as companies realize that, oh, this is a director who's been blessed by the social network, right? It feels like, okay, now that's the one we should choose, right? And so it turns out that then they get on a whole bunch of different boards. And so certainly that is a problem, right? Because it suggests that the numbers are deceiving, that even if it's the case that there are more companies with Black directors, that does not mean that there are more Black directors, right? That there are more absolute numbers. So I do think, again, this is why one of the obstacles is an insular network. We do need to expand the network so that we have more first-time directors, I think, across the board. Because I do think that, while it's a good idea for people to have multiple directorship, everyone has recognized that there are only so many you should be holding before actually you may compromise your ability to be an effective director with regard to any one thing. So it is clearly a concern that we have to be mindful of.
Can we talk about networks a little bit more? So what are some ideas for dealing with the network problem, for expanding the network, for addressing that reality?
Yeah, it's a good question. I will say two ideas or three. So I do think, no knock on the search firms, but, a lot of the research suggests that unless and until you make it clear to the search firm that you are prioritizing race and you will not consider the group that they're sending to you without, right, some level of diversity, then the search person is going to give you what they want. So that's the one thing, right? You can in fact have search firms do work for you, but you have to be very clear with regard to your expectations. And back to this point about kind of multiple directors, and be clear, right? We want in this pool new directors. Don't give us the same list. And we see it in academia. Don't give us the same list of 3 or 4 Black people that always come up when we're considering a slot. Give us a new list, right? Go out and kind of find. So that's one way. The second is actually use these organizations that are focused on promoting diversity. They are out there, right? And like I said, only 8% of companies, that's the latest research, and maybe it's shifted now, but that's a very small percent of companies that rely on these entities focused on diversifying boards. So, you need to link up with those in order to expand your kind of network. And, I think the last thing is, in fact, and it connects to the search firm piece, the something akin to the Rooney Rule, where we're saying, we're not going to consider without, and you could even say, and we're not going to consider without it being someone new, because that also could expand in important ways.
Thank you. So we have time for one more question. This is the regulatory toolkit, right? There's a lot of different options that we might use. Some might be kind of more soft touch approaches like comply or explain step that I think Nasdaq might be taking, versus more direct regulation like California and some other states are mandating. What are your thoughts on what's the best way to approach this, or is there a best way to approach this problem?
I'm a big believer in let 1,000 flowers bloom. Let's do it all and see which one takes root. I think when we think about, so first, I do think it is important to have regulatory intervention, right? All of the studies show that California has that rule has made a tremendous impact on board diversity with regard to gender. And that's true even though people challenge the rule as unconstitutional and otherwise illegal for a bunch of different reasons. And that's because it turns out that for many companies, once you tell them you have to do it, they'll just do it. Like, they're not going to fight you. So when the rule was announced, you started getting a lot of companies saying, okay, they're serious and we need to do that. So that mandate had a both implicit and kind of explicit impact, not only in California, but in other places, but particularly in California. It has really moved the needle with regard to gender diversity in California. Of course, we know that Americans don't really like mandates, right? That there's likely to be a pushback, right? Whether or not you're going to call it quotas or affirmative action, like as soon as that's like the word not to be used, and that will unleash potential backlash and hostility and a list of potential horribles. So that is the trade-off. But again, I think it's the case that California suggests that it can work. To really move the needle. By contrast, you can have these soft touches, like you're right, the Nasdaq, which is comply and explain, so not a mandate. And we have seen that comply and explain rules, can have an impact on behavior, because oftentimes companies don't want to explain. On the other hand, we have also seen that because it's not a mandate, some companies are very much willing to explain and say, you know what, we don't believe it, it's important, we're not going to do it. So that is the trade-off. If you have a softer touch, that it may not move the needle. But when I said, I am perfectly fine to start out that way and see how far it gets us, especially with regard to these other things, because I think in the same way that California has had an impact that mandated, I think that the Nasdaq rule, even in its proposal stage, is having an impact, right? It's making companies realize this is a priority. We have to take this seriously. Right. And sooner or later, we may get to the stage where people will feel like it's important to have a mandate. So let's kind of preemptively decide, hey, is this something we're willing to do and do it, or not. So I think regulatory intervention is important. It will move the needle much more, I think, dramatically than voluntary efforts. And I think there are trade-offs with regard to both.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you so much for joining us, giving us that fantastic talk and answering our questions. So thank you again, and I hope we'll have you back in Iowa sometime soon again.
I'd be more than happy to come in person rather than Zooming in. So thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you so much for this opportunity to engage with you, and listen, everybody, enjoy the rest of the semester.
Bye-bye.
Bye.